Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to Ohio Exopolitcs. I'm your host, Mark Snider. We've got an interesting show lined up for you this evening. Our guests are Crystal Clark and James Horak.
Hello.
Hello, Crystal. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Crystal, I have all kinds of interesting questions.
Okay, I'll do my
I
best.
don't know if you can answer any of them. I don't even know if James can answer some of these. We can throw these out and we can chat a little bit. Are you familiar with the work of Ayn Rand?
To a degree, yes. I'm not familiar with it the way others are, but I am familiar with her. I really do love that quote from her about how we can avoid dealing with reality, but we can avoid the consequences of not dealing with reality. I really like that. And I did see the movies that were patterned off of her books. I've not read her books, but, because movies oftentimes really don't reflect the books properly. A lot goes missing, but I was very, very inspired by the films. I don't know if you've seen those.
I saw a couple interviews that she had done, one with Dan Rather, and I've seen part of one with Phil Donahue, and I got the Wikipedia version of her philosophy. I also got the book. I got the giant book Atlas Shrugged, which is about 1,000 pages long. I don't know if I'm going to be able to read the whole thing,
Oh,
but some of her philosophy is just spectacular. Back in the 1950s, she predicted that collectivism and the welfare state would turn the United States into a dictatorship and cause an economic collapse. And here we sit in 2014, and it looks like we're headed that way.
yes, I agree. One of the things that I've been writing about recently is reality revisionism. And there was an essay I wrote on unsustainable reality revisions and the order out of chaos birth. And the entire environmental movement is a order out of chaos methodology, which, people know as the Hegelian dialectic on all of these things. And there's an excellent video that I embedded into the essay that a man created in 1992 on a VHS tape that's now on YouTube. His name was George Hunt. And he was at some of the original environmental meetings and noticed who was there and thought it was strange. And he talks about precisely this, about collectivism, and how the globalists, the environmental movement was begun by Edmund de Rothschild and marketed by Maurice Strong and financed by the Rockefeller family. None of it's real. That's why it's so hypocritical and duplicitous. They cause the problem. They rile people up to get a reaction that they never would have been able to get out of the people, and then they come in with a solution, which is always take away more of our freedoms. But the interesting thing about it, though, is that he mentioned that they called it the fourth world, and this world, which is the New World Order, was going to fully manifest by having consumed all of the others. And this fellow was very interesting. He talked about Native American shamans who had visions of this fourth world, and they refer to it as the lostness of mind, and how people would be coerced through lies and drugs and various other means of giving up their own self-identity and egos to a collective.
Now, on the flip side of, I would have to ask you this: do you support the burning of the rainforests?
No, I don't. I actually began talking about all of this at the end of 2009 in trying to get people to understand why knowledge of intelligent design is so important. Of course, that term, intelligent design, has a great deal of stigma attached to it because the globalists themselves feign that they detest the idea and that no such thing exists, and yet billions upon billions of dollars of their money is funneled into decoding it so they can weaponize it. And this is what's happened. And this is where the environmental crisis is coming from. I don't know if it was on your last program when we were on, but I've said this many times. What is depopulation and manufactured lack? How do those two things go together? And I've often tried to explain that they are ensuring that there won't be enough for everyone. And I was expressing to James one day how difficult this concept is to convey. And he said, well, what is overpopulation? Isn't it that there isn't enough for everyone? And I said, that's right. And he said, so if you go to the rainforest and you cut it all down, now there isn't enough for everyone and it's overpopulated, isn't it? If you go to the rainforest where the Aborigines live, where it hasn't been touched, and then you cut it all down, now they can sell it as being overpopulated because there's no longer the system to sustain the people who were there. And this is basically what's happening with the environmental movement specifically, is that resources are intentionally being destroyed so that there won't be enough for everyone. And then they will bring in their solution.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's interesting. One of Ayn Rand's philosophies that I think is very interesting is that her philosophy is called objectivism. And it holds, now this will be very contradictory to some people, but I kind of like this point of view. She holds that the mind does not create reality, but rather it is a means of discovering reality. Expressed differently, she says that existence has primacy over consciousness, which must conform to it. So let me elaborate a little bit more. Rand writes, a leaf cannot be red and green at the same time. It cannot freeze and burn at the same time. Expressed differently, a belief in dragons, however sincere, does not mean reality contains any dragons. And I know that kind of contradicts our popular interpretation of quantum mechanics, but I wonder if we might be misinterpreting some of quantum mechanics today.
I think that there's a great deal of truth in that, which I've expressed many, many times before in other shows and writings. And again, this goes back to intelligent design, which I forgot to express that I used the term sacred science for it because I was looking for a neutral term to avoid the stigma attached to it. But I think that's very, very true. We are experiencing a reality that has been designed for us. And I think the entire point is to see what we're going to do with it. And destroying it certainly, I don't think, was ever the intent. So I would agree with that view that we're not creating it while we're here in that sense, if you're going to look at it from a more cosmic view. But in terms of our daily little dramas, I think we absolutely do play a role in creating our own personal realities in the sense of our actions have reactions. Who we associate ourselves with has consequences. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. What we allow or cause to continue, we are responsible for. And I think that the shift towards, well, you can just meditate it away or you can just pray it away, I think is a way of encouraging people not to face their oppressors, which is a way of encouraging people not to change the reality that they are forced to live in a very vapid way.
Thank you for saying that, by the way. I appreciate your objectivity. For example, optical illusions are errors in the conceptual identification of what is seen. And, people say perception is reality, but there are such a thing as optical illusions or errors in your perception. And I think a lot of times today, particularly in the UFO movement, we've forgotten that we need a method of validation through observation, and we need to use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning as well. So I think sometimes people get so subjective in their perceptions that they confuse their perceptions from reality. Would you agree with that, Crystal, or disagree?
I would agree with that, and I think it's actually encouraged. I think it's encouraged at every level of our society. I think this is part of the divide and conquer mechanism. When you consider compartmentalization and what it does, and then you also, not just within an organization, and what's the reasoning behind that? We constantly hear, well, if one part of the mechanism is cut off, the rest of it will still function, or you can't torture people to tell you what the plan is because they don't know. It's the military-industrial complex answer for everything, but compartmentalization encourages ignorance. And my personal view is that ignorance is encouraged Because if people really knew what they were party to, they would no longer continue to cooperate and assist.
That's a very profound statement. When you were thinking of the military-industrial complex, it made me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Everest Racconi or Pierre Sprey.
No.
No. These two guys, they designed the three best fighter planes that we've ever had. The F-16, the F-15, the A-10. The A-10 is not really a fighter plane. It's a attack plane. It's for supporting the troops. These have been the best planes in the world for 15 or 20 years. And these three men have been open critics of the F-35 and the F-22, which are extremely expensive, and they say are flawed in their design. You know, the basic design in aeronautics, like thrust to weight ratio, maneuverability, and things like that. These planes have sacrificed everything for this idea of stealth, which in reality isn't so real. So in a lot of the objective tests that they've run with the F-35 and the F-22 against, you know, Russian planes in terms of simulation, whether it's, I don't know, the Su-27, the MiG-29, or even some of the more advanced Russian fighters, they always get beat, especially within visual range. In one test, the Russians made the comment that destroying the F-35 and the F-22 was like clubbing baby seals. Now, the public doesn't know this yet. I mean, I don't know, for one reason or another, I've had this obsession and interest in this area back 15 or 20 years. So I've been watching the development of these two planes, and it's really kind of disturbing to me, because even this illusion of national security is an extreme illusion. And I know this might be out of your area of expertise, Crystal, but I wonder if you could kind of comment at all on that.
Sure. Actually, I've been talking about this a great deal lately, especially through the principle of reality revisionism. Because what is it? It's what most people don't know is that we have two completely different realities struggling for full manifestation. And as one of those realities wants to wholly consume, dominate, and replace the other, not only can they not ever peacefully coexist, but neither can fully manifest as long as the other one still exists. Does that make sense?
I think there's a lot to be said for what you're saying. Go ahead and elaborate that idea.
So while we worry about, well, you know, is this plane better than that plane? I think what we should be asking ourselves is, why do we need them? What's happening? Who's behind it? We really have to kind of drill down and ask ourselves, why are things the way they are, and who wants them this way, and why do they want them this way?
Let me say this, Crystal. Not only do we not need them, but they suck. Go ahead.
They do. They absolutely suck. And a lot of people are discovering, unfortunately, the hard way, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to live in a world that does not want us to live. And that's only going to get worse.
Well, explain that. What do you mean by that? A world that does not want us to live.
While we have the globalist-owned media, it's like a bad cartoon. When we were kids, you know, the bank robbers with their striped suits and masks would come running out of the bank, and they go around the corner and they hide their loot and they change clothes. And then here comes the angry mob, and they ask these people, which way did they go? And they point over there, and the mob goes running in the wrong direction. And it doesn't matter if they're pointing at Archons, they went that way. They're pointing at Al-Qaeda, they went that way. They're pointing at the Anunnaki, they went that way. They're pointing at, you know, Arabs and ISIS, and it's them. It's always them. So who's the them? The real fanatics, the most dangerous fanatics and zealots on this planet are eugenic globalist fanatics. These are the real terrorists. And it is this mindset, in conjunction with advanced technology, which always, always is intelligent design and the manipulation of it, that has destroyed 6 civilizations before ours and will do so again. We are in the process of living that out.
Well, where's your website again, Crystal?
My website is drowninginabsurdity.org.
And do you have a book now, or what is your main focus in your writing now?
I've written 2 books. The first one I released in 2009, although I took it off the market a couple of years ago to revise and update it. And I do have another one. If people want, I'm the only author on Amazon with the name Crystal Clark, and they can go look at that. And even though the second one is fiction, it's actually, I prefer to call it friction, where reality and fiction meet, because I think that fiction gives us a way to reach so much deeper into a person's psyche to help them see what's really right in front of them, because we have a real problem with psychic blocking on this planet through repetition and revision, which is a problem. But my message has always been the same. Trying to teach people the patterns that lead to an entire civilization's decline, how that involves intelligent design, and how that becomes the knowledge that they withhold. That is the dumbing down process, and the patterns, always the patterns. Because if we think of design as patterns, this is how we've learned everything we know. It's how we know what the letter A is. We've seen the pattern, we've memorized it. It's how we know what a female, a male is, a duck, a plant, a tree. But they only go so far with it in school. And there's a reason for that. They're weaponizing it, and they're turning it in on itself. They're killing nature to kill us. And really what happens in a civilization in the very, very beginning, go way, way, way back, the first thing that happens that leads towards the end of a civilization is a form of elitism. And this elitism separates humanity. It compartmentalizes and separates humanity into 2 different groups that are no longer working together towards the same goals or evolutionary processes. And this becomes what we today are calling a breakaway civilization. This is survivable long term, even though it creates an inequitable society where you have a master and slave construct, and you have the wealth versus poverty and knowledge versus ignorance. It's survivable. But if it isn't stopped, it progresses. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is a little bit different. This is when we reach the industrialized age, and this is when the war machine really picks up and it starts to destroy more and more of what people will often refer to as natural law, which we could also say is intelligent design. When we get to phase 3 is when we have things like the artificial manipulation of weather, biowarfare, atomic bombs, Fukushima's, Gulf of Mexico's. When this mentality is allowed to remain in power in conjunction with advanced technology, this is survivable only for a very, very short period of time. And I would say we're at a point now, and I know this really depresses people, and it shouldn't, and I'll tell you why, but we are at a point now where we maybe have a decade left, maybe, at this rate. Because in phase 3, what accelerates the process is you have billions of people that are conned into participating in their own demise out of ignorance, under false pretenses of doing the exact opposite. And so now it's not just a small group of people stirring it. It's everyone stirring it in the same direction, and it starts to spin really, really fast while it goes down the drain. And what I want to say, though, next is this is a very small group of people. And we absolutely can turn things around. I did a show last week where I was mentioning some of the patterns. You know, the globalist agenda is really a return to Roman law based on what I've seen. And the people I was talking to said, oh, yeah, well, that's happened before and that's happened before. But the real question is why? Why is there always a push to go back to it? Because we have to be able to equate this with the fact that our personal freedoms, this is the war that's going on. These are the 2 competing realities. You have the globalist reality that wants to completely subsume and consume sovereign individual freedoms, whether they're individual as a person, a state, or a nation. Consume them all. So the more power we have, the less power they have. The less power and freedom we have, the more power they have. It's like this dial that goes back and forth. Do you see what I'm saying? So this is always the struggle. Everything really can be looked at in that context. So why is there always a push to go backwards by these people in this mindset? And the reason is that backwards for us is forwards for them. Forwards for us is backwards for them. And it's the same thing with their order out of chaos methodology, because what people don't really realize is that our chaos is their carefully planned order. This is what regime change is. It's a reality revision. They create the chaos, and then they come in and they reorder it the way they want to. And this, too, is something that we have actually seen in films for decades, when we see this, demonic or satanic figure standing there with a scorched earth in the background, and they're standing there triumphantly. We always wonder at the logic of that, don't we? Why would you destroy something that you intended to rule over? But the connection people don't make is that's the entire point. It's based on building a new world on the ashes of the old one. It has to be wholly destroyed, because we will always have this struggle unless it is. And it really doesn't matter what side of the coin you're on. If you're the free individual that wants a future in which individuals are still free, the other reality must be completely wiped out, because our reality will never be able to manifest as long as the other one is still trying to manifest itself. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and
So this is the struggle.
Well, I thought I got a message from James that said he was ready.
Oh, good. Well, let's bring him on then. Then I'm off the hook. Oh, well, that's good.
Well, James, I've been speaking to your... Is this James?
Yes, this is James.
I heard you would not be available this evening.
Well, no, we were expecting the show to start at 8 o'clock.
Oh, 8 o'clock your time.
Yeah.
Yes, I got the time wrong, too. Isn't that funny? I don't know how we did that.
I'm in a really sarcastic, joking mood tonight, and I just had this thought, Crystal, that you are kind of James' handler or something. I don't know.
Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Later. Have a good evening.
I'm hearing other voices.
That was the background. That was my good friend Nash Woods.
Okay.
I have Nash Woods to thank for being able to come online at all.
Crystal was just doing a fantastic job, and we were having a very interesting conversation, and the listeners are going to think we planned all this, but believe me, we didn't.
Not even close.
Not even at all.
There's very little that I would talk about that Crystal can't cover adequately.
One of the things I wanted to throw out to you, does Zionism play a role in all this?
Of course it does. It represents the greatest evil ever been set upon mankind.
Well, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
What does it teach? The Talmud teaches that this form of Jewry, Zionist, which differs from Orthodox Jewry, and that the Zionists believe in a homeland, Orthodox Jews don't. It teaches that all other living human beings on the planet are animals, goyim, to be disposed of at will, that you can't sin against them, that they are here for the edification of the chosen. If that isn't the ultimate evil, then I don't know what is.
I'm going to throw this at Crystal, since we kind of were in the middle of a conversation here. One of the questions I wanted to ask her was, Crystal, do you write in fiction to avoid cognitive dissonance in your listeners?
I think that's a great way to explain it. Yes, I think that it's a very helpful tool. Yes. I don't only write in fiction. Well, actually, the first book, I've written fiction and nonfiction. I've written both. I've tried it both ways.
Do you think that bringing out these hard truths that we've been talking about, for example, in the first half an hour of the show, that these truths, this reality, this concrete reality, produces a kind of cognitive dissonance in people where they have two ideas which are in conflict with each other?
They absolutely do. And I tell you what, if you don't mind, I would like to segue this over to James about Ebola.
Sure.
Because Ebola is an excellent example of this. And before I have James talk about it, I do want to say to people listening, if you just a moment to conjure the image that they've been using for Ebola up in your mind and really, really look at it. without other people telling you what you're looking at. I want to explain to people you have seen images of these critters your entire lives, whether learning about the life cycle of a fly or how to improve your garden soil. And at no point prior to the reality revision attempt did they ever try to convince you were looking at a virus. And this is exactly what you were just talking about. They are purposefully presenting people with conflicting views. Why are they showing the picture of a worm and telling you it's a virus? And on top of that, why did so many people go along with it? You see, this is a form of psychic block that happens through repetition. So maybe James would like to talk about what Ebola really is.
There were a number of sites that were entertaining the concept, and in some cases the evidence of Ebola being an organism and not a virus, because a virus is not a complete organism. That's why an organism in the form of a germ can be treated with antibiotics, and no antibiotics work on a virus. The distinguishing factors that discriminate between the two. So they've been removed. Ask yourself this, and I want your audience to bear this in mind. In the past, every time that any imminent danger, whether it be a volcano, whether it be earth shaking, or it will be something that might in any way create a massive panic, they sit on it. They don't build it up into something it's not. They go the other way.
Mm-hmm.
But when they have a false flag, they promote it in every way they can. Hence, consider this to be the false flag of all false flags, where they can get you to take something into your body they control, and that becomes an access for whatever they want to put into your body, just like the chemicals, and engineer smart varieties of it. All of it's designed against the welfare of the person who's going to be inoculated with this vaccine. And then think about all the incongruities and how all this has come about. It originated in Sierra Leone, right smack where Fort Detrick has a laboratory, and these people are infamous for creating biological weapons. And then it spread to other parts of Africa, but there are parts of Africa that hasn't touched. Now, there is communication, travel, and so forth between all these parts of Africa. There is no quarantine effect. The quarantines that have been imposed here are a laugh. Many people have criticized them. How can you have quarantines when you have open borders? How can you have all sorts of things like bringing infected people, supposedly infected with Ebola, into the country to treat them when the best treatments lie in Africa, where these people have had success rates of treating it and experience treating it, right? So it's not something that requires technology that's not admittedly available anywhere in the world with a simple transport flight. So here we go again. We get into this in one incongruity after another, and one inconsistency after another, one contradiction after another. It's one of those things that if it smells like a dead rat, it is a dead rat, and this smells like a dead or a would-be dead false flag opportunity. And that's all I believe it is, and I think that there are a number of people online that would agree with me that have done the research, that have compared their notes on this, and they've all come to the same conclusion. If it's an organism, it's not a virus, it can't be treated with a vaccine, then why are they saying, well, we're fast-tracking a vaccine? And I noticed on the news tonight, and this is mass media news, that they had a successful trial with their first attempt at a vaccine. Well, this is something that they will admit takes from 10 years to 15 years to perfect. So you can automatically assume if it's on a trial basis of, say, 4 or 5 months, that they don't care whether they treat you with a effective vaccine or not. In fact, we still have all this disparity between any vaccine being any good at all, ever shown to be any good. And it would include soft vaccine, which began as a farce, was proven a fraud, and discredited completely.
So is a virus considered an organism?
Mm-mm. No. It can be in the form of mixture of proteins that get involved with the cellular integrity of the individual it's in, and affects the way in which sister cells are replicated from those cells that it infects.
If it helps, Mark, there used to be, before they started revising reality in this direction, There used to be very distinct differences between viruses and things like parasites.
Mm-hmm.
Viruses were once considered non-living biological contaminants because they do not feed for sustenance and they cannot reproduce using their own parts. And in older dictionaries that were written before these revisions, very strangely, it will seem to a lot of people, if you look it up, it will say that it's a form of poison and often snake venom. So that's the difference between a virus and a parasite. And the changes that were made to the definition of a parasite removed the need for physical attachment to the host and included shelter. So now any living thing that needs another living thing for food or shelter is considered a parasite, which of course leads us back to the parasitic view of humanity, and we know where that's coming from.
Well, let me throw this out, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, virus still has DNA and RNA, right? It still has...
It can have, not necessarily. What it has, it can have the building blocks of certain proteins that are going to be taken into the cell, but with a variation, it's going to affect the reproduction or the cell division of that cell into a sister cell. And the sister cell, which we could describe as second generation, but theoretically, it's a sister cell. It's divided from its sister. It affects what a lot of people think of as a mutation, but it's just a variation. And that variation is seldom beneficial.
I've heard viruses described as organisms on the edge of life, and I thought viruses do reproduce, correct?
No, they don't.
No, they have to be replicated.
The only way of reproducing is by using a host cell that they affect in a way that will lead to a variation in the sister cell.
So does the virus essentially replicate itself by changing the DNA of the cell that it goes into?
It changes the environment of the cell. It changes the way in which that cell will put together its own protein and what the sister cell that it replicates will be, what its characteristics will be. For instance, like in a cancer, what happens is that the environment is changed so that the cells around have to compete. They're competing in a lower oxygen environment so that they convert over to anaerobic function to be able to compete better, thereby losing their function for the tissue they're in and giving off toxins at a higher rate.
Now, James, no one there is listening to the radio right now, are they? I'm getting a little echo.
Oh, that's Nash. He's listening to the program.
We're getting that echo.
Does he have to turn it off?
Yeah, he needs to turn that off, yeah.
Oh, it's fine.
You know, Mark, I just wanted to add that I think it's very helpful to people to look at a biological virus as biohacking, the same way a technological virus goes in. If it knows the source code, it goes into the computer, it begins to rewrite the code, and now the program no longer functions the same.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same principle, but they're not living entities.
Yeah. It's just like with chemical or radiological mutations. What they create is seldom beneficial, either beneficial to any host or beneficial to their survival.
I've heard viruses described really as not living things, that they're more or less information, so to speak. And I think the analogy, I guess, that Crystal was making, it's almost like someone putting a bug in a computer program or, messing with the source code.
There is something really interesting about that I asked James the other day that I think that you would find really incredible, although whether in a good way or a bad way is debatable. When you look at things through design, you try to understand their purpose and function. And we can look at things, we can look at microbes and fungi, and we can see their purpose, but not viruses. They don't seem to have any beneficial purpose in nature. So I asked James, I thought the other day, I said, well, are these maybe leftover Frankenstein experiments from a previous lineage? And I think you might find his answer interesting.
Okay.
That's a possibility. There are other possibilities, but I think that is probably the most significant one. We find in nature, in everything, when it is in balance, it's self-healing. And anything that is on any scale that is counter-evolutionary, which viruses are, it ends up getting scrapped. But when man meddles And using dioxin finds a way to genetically engineer things that throw nature out of balance. It may take sometimes an entire lineage or more for this balance to be restored, and in a partial manifestation, it may take much longer. It may take the correction of the time continuum before anything can be done of that sort at all.
You know, these vaccines produce an artificially acquired immunity, and even that can be unhealthy, can it?
Oh, yeah. Well, here's the variation. Any kind of immunity is variation. In humans that acquire immunity, that is when things are in balance. When there is in a chemical lab that is devising a biological weapon and it gets loose, like may have happened here. When that doesn't happen, the corrections are part of nature. When they're not made, for instance, I speak of cancer, and this is the whole scope of all cancer, as being an immune response. And this would indicate what you're saying exactly, because that's what it is. If you try to treat it as a disease and attack it with the very things that cause cancer or promote it, like radiation and chemotherapy, you might stress the body to fight back, and you might get a desirable result one time out of 10,000. But it's probably very much like trying to adjust the carburetor of your car with a submachine gun inside your house.
That's a good analogy. Well, at one time they had a germ theory of disease, and they don't even think that's real anymore, do they?
I'll tell you what has had a lot to do with changing that, and that is their resistance to acknowledging that on meteorites and on things that they find in the deep ice cavities of the Antarctic, they find tissue even that is alive and can be brought back to life very easily when it's not, what we call living fossils. So they find these things, and they want to cling to life and the idea of the concept of life, but they want to hold to mythology too. So they get caught up in these contradictions because they're not flexible enough to be able to originate new finds and correspondingly relate them to the old understandings, because it changed them. They would challenge old beliefs and principles, and we don't have a single principle in science or in agriculture or any field of endeavor on this planet that couldn't stand a little adjusting.
I think we got the first images of virus back in 1931 when they developed the electron microscope. Is that true, James?
That's right. Well, it took electron microscope, something that could see something at an enlargement of 250,000 times to actually see the building blocks of proteins. The virus came into the picture, and they started seeing that there were things going on that they didn't quite understand, so they began to try to understand submolecular particles and other things and how they were related. And that's when we began to really get deep into genetics and to see that there was more to genetics than just simply gene alignment on a chromosome.
Crystal, you had some more questions, didn't you, for James?
I did. First, let me say it's very, very gracious of you to let us ask these questions from listeners on your show. Although I do apologize, I don't have them in front of me at the moment because I too had the wrong time for the show.
Well, go get the questions. Go get the questions.
I remember a couple of them, I think, well enough. There was only a handful. But one of them, which I think is really fascinating, is on the last show that James did with you, you asked him about Kepler 22b.
Right.
And he said that that was the original Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question that I would like to pose to James is, if that is the original Earth, why does it not look like this planet, in terms of if the geographical lay of the land and the oceans in the photos that we are shown?
Well, that's a very good question, and of course, it doesn't matter. I'm kind of reluctant to ascribe the actual mechanism. It's hidden from view for what it is. And of course, it's in a proper place with respect of the solar activity that it enjoys, correspond with Earth, but then it's actually seeing it for what it is. There are planets in the solar system that you don't see as it is. You don't see Ganymede as it is. You don't see Phobos as it is. And when probes go near Phobos, they disappear. And that's been an ongoing thing now. There you have the Black Knights, which, again, the question is, we're so capable with our Space Wars junk. Why haven't we approached the satellites and tried to crack what they are?
James, do you have a headset there?
Yes.
Okay, so you're on a headset right now?
Yes.
Okay. What I'm hearing is you sound far away, but what I hear is these really loud thumps and bumps and all kinds of noises in the background. I don't know why that would be.
Well, I really...
Am I right, Crystal?
Yes, it's an imperfect situation, that's for sure, but I'm just grateful that James was able to join us.
So, Crystal, you're not James's handler. You don't work for the CIA or anything, right?
No, actually, I contacted James in 2011. I first heard him come out on the Kevin Smith show. We didn't know each other. I had come out at the end of 2009, and at the beginning of 2010, someone said, "Hey, go listen to this guy on Kevin Smith because he's saying similar things." And I blew him off, which James knows this. I apologize. I just blew him off and thought, I think he's crazy. Unfortunately, it took about another year and a half before I listened again to some of the things that he was saying. And by this time, the conversation had progressed where he was concerned. And he was the only other person on the entire planet that I had ever heard say that we have done this before. And by this, I mean self-destruction episodes. He said there's been 6 times before. That's what I came across in my research. And he also understood that we were repeating all of the same patterns that were going to cause it again. That really got me. When I heard that, I had to pay attention because this is what I had been trying to share with people, and it was very difficult to do. I don't know. I really couldn't understand why, but I found another person who knew this. And the other reason I was so keen on contacting James is I think the most profound knowledge, the most liberating and powerful knowledge any human being on this planet can have is that of design. And I'm always looking to acquire more of it because we can't be snowed when we know how things really work. If we know that Ebola is in fact a parasite that voraciously eats the organs and connective tissue of its victims, we can't be snowed into taking toxic vaccines because we know better. And not only did James understand the past the way I understood it, but he also has a grasp and knowledge of intelligent design that is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like it. So that's why James and I kind of do what we do together, but we started out at different places, and kind of met along the way. So no, we're just friends, very dear friends.
I have some very, very deep and profound questions. You're saying that Ebola is a parasite?
Yeah.
Yes, Ebola is a parasite. It is not a virus. And you can't vaccinate against a parasite. So God only knows what's going to be in those vaccines. But it damn sure is not going to be for an Ebola virus that does not exist in nature. This is a very, very serious issue. And if people knew that, and here's the other thing where reality revisionism comes into play, because you have digital reality revisionism, in which all of the online references to Ebola as a parasite have been replaced with Ebola as a virus.
Okay, we'll get back to that on the other side. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitcs. I'm your host. Remember, Revolution Radio is listener-supported radio. Press that PayPal button, make a donation so the station can stay alive. We can afford the servers and keep bringing you great programming like the show this evening. Our guests this evening are Crystal Clark and James Horak, and I've got my producer Keith Roberts here. We're talking about Ebola, and I want to get off this topic, but it is pretty darn interesting. Let me read what the CDC is saying about Ebola. Ebola is a rare and deadly disease caused by infection with a strain of the Ebola virus. The 2014 Ebola epidemic is the largest in history, affecting multiple countries in West Africa. The risk of an Ebola outbreak affecting multiple people in the U.S. is very low. So the CDC is saying Ebola is a virus and that this is the largest epidemic in history of Ebola. And you guys are going to tell me neither one of those is true, right?
Well, no. Remember what I was saying about the image that they're using. If Ebola is a virus, why do they keep showing you the image of the parasitic worm?
That's to produce cognitive dissonance.
Yes. And I thought it was interesting that during the break, a snippet from The Matrix was played. And when there is a reality revision, there is a discontinuity in the storyline. And I really love that scene from The Matrix when Neo sees the cat walk by twice. And they want to know, was it the same cat? And they explain to him that these kinds of discontinuities are telling you that they've changed something. And this is actually very, very true, and I think a very beautiful portrayal of exactly what we're talking about. That image of the parasitic worm is in itself a discontinuity in the Ebola virus storyline, and it's the only image they have ever used. If they have an Ebola virus image, why aren't they using the correct image?
Have you guys heard of Disaster City in Texas?
No.
It's a training site for first responders. And they're training first responders in Disaster City to respond to Ebola. And guess what they're using? Robots to respond to Ebola. Now, do you think they're working in the transhumanist agenda here as well?
I think they're working in the fear agenda.
We'll elaborate on that.
You can't argue with a robot. Comes up, and if you want to take the inoculation, it forces you into a corner and gives it to you.
My goodness. I think we're heading to a scientific dictatorship. We're going to see Google cars. They're going to take away our right to drive. They're going to try anyway. And then, of course, the Google brain implant is coming soon.
Well, the impediment to the New World Order implementation, of course, is BRICS. And it's all over the fall of the petrodollar, and that there are countries that want to insulate themselves from those effects and have joined with all accepting and giving gold-backed currency for oil. And you see, this is the greatest power shift in the West that we've seen since World War II. And the reason that it is so threatening to the powers that be in the West, namely England and the United States, is that it will shatter the value of the currency here to as low as they'll allow it. And that, they call it an adjustment. It's on the horizon. And so they are speeding up all the nastiness that they've been employing in a lessened way with gradualism in order to cram it down our throats before we understand we have options. And we do have options. We have options today. We didn't have options. They would have enacted this before 2000. You remember the H1N1 virus? That was the first attempt to do what they're trying to do with Ebola.
Crystal, any comments?
Yeah, I agree. I think the entire thing is more nefarious than that, judging by the mindset of the people behind it, because these people believe themselves to be, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in this too. They believe themselves to be a superior race of humans genetically. They believe the rest of us to be an inferior race of humans that are aimlessly wandering around like automatons, waiting for meaningful input from a higher intellectual source that will give us something productive to do. And they believe that they are that source, that higher intellectual source. This, of course, is not true. You know, this two different species, you know, it's a delusion. But I think that the point of transhumanism is to eventually make it true. And I do believe that even in the context of reality revisionism that we talked about before, a successful reality revision requires the elimination of the competition or competing reality, which is quite often is the truth. And I think that vaccines that change the way our bodies function, how long we live, and on, I think qualify as the elimination of the competition, which I think is part of the goal of transhumanism. I think it's very nefarious.
Uh, you know, it's very interesting because Hitler was very focused on the Aryan master race, which really he was not a part of the Aryan race.
No, this was more than anyone else Himmler, and it was an aspect of ethnic racism, very much like what you see in the Zionism today.
Well, don't you think that maybe there was an element of self-hate here with Hitler?
No, I think there was one element that no one ever talks about. He had a Zionist doctor that was feeding him methamphetamine and telling him it was vitamins.
Oh. Well, he had to be able to look in the mirror and see that he wasn't blonde-haired and blue-eyed, right?
There are a lot of Jewish people that aren't. They're more Arabic than they are anything else.
Didn't Hitler actually have some Jewish ancestry?
Yes, he did.
Now that is fascinating. Now psychologically, I mean, talk about cognitive dissonance.
He was also a good artist.
He was a great artist, right? Well, I don't know, great. He was good, yeah.
Well, he was an impressionist. German Impressionism is, well, I'm very fond of it, you know, so I am rather biased, but not towards Hitler, of course, but I'm biased towards German Impressionism.
Well,
and he was a good German Impressionist.
And think about the tremendous power of persuasion that guy had.
Well, you have to understand that he actually did bring Germany out of the dregs of massive inflation and depression at the same time, and restored national sovereignty, restored national pride, and he changed, just like Napoleon. You have to understand that when these leaders have that much power, the infiltration machine of their enemies has to be very sophisticated. And I've explained how it was in terms of Napoleon, and it was equally in terms of Hitler.
Crystal, I know you had something to say there. Go ahead.
Yes, we've all heard the phrase that the winners write history. And this is very, very true. You know, we've seen films that portray rulers that conquer a nation and they strike the record, strike the names of certain families or events from the historical record and alter it. And there is it's a 6.5-hour documentary about Hitler. It's called The Greatest Story Never Told, and ironically, a lot of your listeners are going to find it's been banned in their country, but if they do a web search for that same term, they can actually find the website, the original website, and may be able to find versions that they can view in their country. Yeah. And this is so mind-blowing that it will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because if we can go back to the patterns that these people use, and it's always the same pattern, like you were talking about a moment ago with the technological dictatorship, I'm convinced that the reason for the surveillance is not finding terrorists. It's looking for the dissenters and heretics from the official narrative so that we can have the new witch hunts, and they're going to start branding people that won't go along with the party line as terrorists. And we've already seen that shift. We had homegrown terrorists, and now we have nonviolent extremists. And there is a shift in the language to, well, we're going to have to do some social media vetting and, you know, determine who's going to be able to go online and who isn't based on their views. And I think Hitler was an excellent case, and probably the least well-known case, of someone who was vilified and turned into an enemy when, in fact, I believe the documentary makes a very convincing case that Hitler was actually trying to save his country from Zionist infiltration, and mentioned as much in his own speeches. He had Muslims in his army. They had their own Muslim leaders, their own squadron leaders. There are images of the beautiful Quran that he gave them. He had Jews in his army.
And he had Jews in high-ranking positions.
That's right. He was not an anti-Semitic. He was anti-Zionist. I mean, it's powerful. I will tell you, it's a very, very powerful documentary, and I can't recommend it enough.
Well, the thing that people don't realize about Hitler and the Thule Society knew about our previous civilizations. They knew about Atlantis and Lemuria. They knew about our real history. They were trying to find out about our real history, and that may have been why they were vilified. What do you think about that?
Well, in many aspects, that's true. They had a group of scientists go to Tibet, go to Mongolia, that were doing archaeology work, and trying to study certain people that are remarkably anomalous, especially in Mongolia.
Well, it's very interesting. The Thule Society, they knew about this, what we call a mythical northern country called Hyperborea. And they knew at one time that the poles of our planet were very, very different, and that we had a lost ancient landmass in the extreme north. And they knew about Plato's Atlantis. Can you discuss that at all, James?
First of all, Atlantis was more than an island. It was a civilization. It was so immense that it used plots of land in the Amazon basin, which you can find today. They're terraced, they're irrigated, and there's over 160,000 of these. They're roughly a little larger than an acre, and this was where they grew their food supply. They were very advanced. They had an ability to store food through famine and through problems that might arise from volcanoes erupting, where the ash will just spoil a crop. They had envoys. They are responsible for the first buildings in South America where you see what is mistaken for Olmec. And you find that they had very precise method of cutting stone. They had airborne airships. They did a number of things, but that's just one lineage. They did have a conflict with the Blondes, and that's what led to their rapid demise.
James, do you think that the Germans/Nazis with the Thule Society, that roughly around World War II time, maybe a little bit earlier, developed a kind of anti-gravity or electrogravitic craft?
Well, they weren't the first. Of course, not even in this lineage, they weren't the first. A lot of people have developed wafers that they could float in the air and direct. There was a watchmaker in a part of Europe, mountainous part of Europe, that found a geometric configuration and made a watch that had gravitic power, and it started boring through the ceiling until he took a sledgehammer to it. He took that design, he made a UFO, and this UFO had the capability of going up as far as he wanted to go. It wasn't capable, of course, of protecting anyone outside the Van Allen belt. And he had a lot of fun with it. There was Story and Fate magazine, which I checked out, and I found relatives of the people that were involved in this particular little item, and mentioned it in a Kevin Smith show. But when I checked it out, what happened was these people in this village where this watchmaker lived were out in a meadow having some kind of I'm sorry for the noise, had a celebration of some sort. And everyone was wearing their finery, and this craft comes down in the middle of the meadow, and everyone goes over. They're surprised. Most of them, they don't know about what this watchmaker's been doing. And the door opens, and out steps the watchmaker and a couple of ladies in their finery. And everybody's astonished, and they say, well, why don't you come in, look it over, we'll even take you for a ride. And some of the people do. They go in. And it looks like a railroad turnstile with the levers and stuff, very crude. And then there are a row of seats that go around the center where this turnstile is, what looks like a turnstile. Of course, all it does is it moves these configurations of gears that he copied after the geometry that he found or that he created in this watch that he was making with a repeater. And so he decided to play a joke on them. So they said, well, after it was all over, he said, well, I need some fuel. And they said, oh, you do? Yeah, go get me a glass of water, which is just a lark. Whatever happened to that, I have no idea, and I'm not at liberty to discuss where this village is or contact with these people because they are afraid. The village after that kept this hidden, tried to suppress it, but there was a member of the press that just happened to be among those people. That's how the story got out. But they were afraid they'd be accused of fraud and didn't want the publicity, didn't want the curiosity seekers and stuff.
I wonder if we might have been better off if the Nazis had won instead of the globalists being in power, because Victor Schauberger, I think, created an implosion engine. And the Vril, during that time, created a levitation disc. And I think there was a craft called the Hanabu that was developed in Germany that was able to actually fly to the moon and beyond. Now, have you researched any of that information, James?
Well, if that's true, and it could be, it didn't carry anyone, because the trick to flying outside the Van Allen belt, or even into the Van Allen belt, is having a metal that can be ionized, create a field that can protect the people inside the craft from the maneuvers that any kind of anti-gravity craft can do, and the cosmic bombardment that even harms the people that fly high altitude above 65,000 feet. If they don't get radical mineral replacement after they've been on a trip that high, they suffer tremendously. They lose magnesium and calcium and iron, and also suffer from a lot of destroyed red blood cells, because the small particles that are traveling at very high speeds go right through the cell and kill it. When they come back to Earth, this is one thing that will determine that the astronauts did not get to the moon on a rocket.
I mean, couldn't you build kind of a magnetic field around your craft or some kind of electronic shield that would help with some of that?
Not without a metal that has a perfect grain.
Okay. The blondes did do that, right?
Yes, blondes are very advanced, but of course they're members of the extended community. They're civilized. They don't have aberrancy. When you have what they have, you have the ability for one person to hold in his hand the ability to destroy a planet. And you see, we have individuals that have that heightened sense of responsibility, but we have probably even more individuals that don't. And when you look today at the savagery that runs amok on this planet, we just had a 12-year-old murdered by a policeman. That's going to go real well when it becomes wider known. But you have this kind of savagery, and you have no reason for it except savagery. I mean, there's no better way. Well, you have the leaders, the powers that be, that enjoy these complications and promote them. And so you have a situation on this planet that is nearing extinction. And I've talked about this before. If you don't change things, if you don't change your leadership, put people in place that will take a sincere desire to save this planet. You're destroying the Pacific Ocean. You destroyed the Gulf of Mexico. These are food baskets for a large percentage of the humans on this planet. And yet there are problems that are being broached by very few people in the mass media, if any. And you have a number of people in the alternative media that don't pay due respect to these problems and apply the significance that are due. So, and you have people running around saying, oh, if we just love everyone enough, it'll all go away. And you have people that are corrupted by money that are paid to go after people that say things like we're saying here. So this has got to change, and it's got to change very quickly. We can't sit on our butts anymore and pretend that we can survive if these changes aren't made. We simply can't do that.
I'm going to make a big jump on topic here a little bit. I want to dive into this a little bit if you guys don't mind. We can go wherever you want. But I did do some research this afternoon. I went back and I studied Ringmakers of Saturn again, and then I kind of went down my own rabbit hole, which was extremely interesting. But one of the things that Dr. Berggren said in Ringmakers of Saturn, which I thought was really, really interesting, he said that evidence is 100% positive that propulsive vehicles generated the inner and outer A-rings of Saturn.
Yeah,
and,
well, he saw this in progress.
Yeah. I mean, it's really huge.
The size of North America.
Yeah, I mean, this discovery is staggering.
You know, I was in touch with him, and we were talking, and he was leaning more and more to seeing these EMVs as threatening. And so I told him that they weren't. And, of course, when I said it decidedly, that turned on his alarms. And then I said they'll be seen in the sun, and they'll be seen forming the energy of the sun. And I explained why that was so important. And he said, how do you know this? How do you know this? They hadn't been recognized as in the sun at that point. And finally, I said something to him that ended our relationship, although I continued a relationship with his colleague, Casey Dawkins. And later on, when a former colleague of mine betrayed Dr. Bergman, I was the one that informed her and thus Dr. Bergman that what he had done behind their back, while all the while he was pretending to be helpful and to be sympathetic. And finally, this individual sent me an email telling me, well, everyone has their price, don't they?
Oh.
Well, I don't have my price. Crystal doesn't have her price. Taurus doesn't have her price. Mary doesn't have her price. Shinny doesn't have his price. And my new friend and honored friend, Nash, doesn't have his price. These people are beyond that. These are the people that I think of when I wonder about why in the hell I'm here.
Are you familiar with Dr. Bergren's UFO sighting near Pajaro Dunes, California?
Yes, right off the coast of Santa Barbara. What he saw, and he has a model of it that he shows when he lectures, or when he used to lecture. That is an appendage of an EMB. It's not an energy body, it's not a living thing, but it's an appendage. And believe it or not, that was tailored as a demonstration for him.
He described these balls of plasma that were coming out of this craft that were forming these streamers, and he said the streamers were chartreuse in color. What a shocking visual image that must have been.
It was, and of course it awakened him to many things because it reaffirmed so much of what he saw. He never had any of his colleagues, other scientists, try to debunk him. The only people that worked overnight and through the day to do so were ufologists. He would go to these UFO conferences with Casey, and they would get a table, and he would try to make connection with Richard Hoagland. And then Richard Hoagland and his people would shun Dr. Bergman. Now, bear in mind, Hoagland is no scientist. He has played the part of a consultant, but he's no scientist, and Dr. Bergman is an esteemed scientist and has worked for both Ames, NASA, and JPL, and recognized an expert in his fields. And there's several. This is to be taken in consideration as to why these gatekeepers are so threatened by Dr. Bergman. They're after money. They're part of the cottage industry in ufology. And someone that comes up with something that changes everything, changes that paradigm that we hold true to cosmology. Someone that does that threatens their little realities, their little discoveries, their little suppositions, their little proposals about how things work. And of course, they can't take that context. They can't take the fact that somebody has jumped light years ahead of them and come up with something that demonstrates design, that demonstrates how we can survive being near a fusion star.
I'm surprised to hear you say that Hoagland did not want to hear what Dr. Bergman had to say.
Hoagland is a gatekeeper.
So are these gatekeepers, are they being paid by globalists? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you have to look into each one for the circumstance that dominates their motivation. I can guess about Hoagland's. I think that Hoagland has the wrong people, always had the wrong people around him. I know that his webmaster, Keith Rowland, was dirty. I had conflicts with him. Remember the Enterprise mission?
Yeah.
Which was a forum? And I got into a real good discussion with the physicists on that, and it crashed the Enterprise mission. And it stayed crashed for 3 or 4 months, and when it came up, it was no longer an open forum.
Wow.
And I got into conflicts with Keith Rowland all the time. And then I found out that Keith Rowland was also the webmaster for Art Bell. So I knew that Art Bell would go so far and then he'd back off. He'd go so far and he'd back off. He never followed anything to its full extent. Never. And I don't think that it was Art Bell because I like Art Bell, and so did Kevin Smith. He thought a lot of him. Keith Rowland was a filter of information that was coming to him. I know some information I tried to get to Art Bell, for instance, one time. Didn't reach him.
James, have you ever done any research on density wave theory?
Well, I understand what it implies, what it indicates, and what causes people to use that terminology, but I look at it differently than the direction people are going today. It's just like with gravity wave. Gravity wave is spoken about, but no one defines it. I do, and it's quite simple. And when you understand gravity wave, then you understand a large part of what is behind the drive and navigation of EV craft. And that's something more than these people that are trying to reverse engineer them understand. They think that the weapon that it's on the craft is the drive, and it isn't. Even Bob Lazar, a very gifted individual and a very honorable person who was right. Again, the UFO community, starting with Stan Friedman, had to debunk at all costs because it was one of those things that their handlers didn't want discussed, what Bob Lazar had to say about his experiences at Groom Lake.
Any comments, Crystal?
No, not at all. I'm fascinated while I'm listening.
Okay.
Yeah.
James, let's go back to Saturn for a minute, because I've heard that the A-ring on Saturn, the outer edge of that A-ring is maintained by something that physicists now are calling orbital resonance with with the two moons, Janus and Epiphomet, I guess they call it. I can't pronounce it. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, it becomes luminescent as cosmic bombardment and light from our star hits it. What's going on is very simple, and of course I would have loved to have been able to discuss it with Dr. Berggren, what the point of building those rings are. They're rings around other planets. This is a process, a preliminary process of terraforming our planets in a solar system. You take matter from planets and you put them where they can be kept from roving, and like you put them in an orbital configuration around a planet like Saturn, and let this solar and cosmic bombardment reduce them down to a point where they are useful for terraforming. You've heard me speak about the mineral in Nevada that exists in large dumps all over the state, and the only place on Earth where they're to be found, and it's how efficacious it is to complex tissue, but it is vital for life to begin on any planet. And so when a planet or a moon is to be terraformed, this is the source of the terraforming. It's taken by the EMVs back to that planet or that moon to originate complex life, an environment that's friendly for complex life. And of course, it is a building block of all life on every stellar body. It always has been.
Dr. Berggren said that the rings were much thicker where the EMVs were.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Well, it's very important because in the last 50 years, the question of the survival of this planet and what this planet will become after the seventh extinction has been discussed far and wide among the extended community, and this is a preparation for if the worst outcome comes about.
Now, there are also divisions in these rings.
Yeah, the Cassini being the foremost. It was a Cassini that Dr. Berggren used in order to triangulate the size of the EMVs that were at each termini of the A-ring. And that's what enabled him, because probes had been there, he was able to determine the size of the EMVs as being the size of North America.
And one of the reasons they sent the Voyager program, the two unmanned space missions, the Voyager 1 and the Voyager 2 out there, is that they were trying to take advantage of this favorable alignment of the planets in the late 1970s. So those spacecraft could make one pass and they could look at Saturn and they could look at Jupiter. Is that true, James?
Yes, but even in 1970, or as early as 1970, they had the capacity of placing a spy satellite around Saturn that would have given them more complete data and would have kept giving them complete data for an indeterminate amount of time. they had that ability to determine what was on the plane of Cydonia on Mars and to actually determine the detail at close range of the face on Mars, which they ended up lying about ultimately. So they have had this ability ever since the late 60s of putting around planets spy satellites that could do the same thing around any planet in our solar system with the exception of Mercury, of doing it with rockets that they had at their disposal, and get the kind of surveillance images that they were getting with the U-2 and with the spy satellites that they were sending up as early as 1972.
So Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 were kind of a dog and pony show for the public?
Well, you can bet they weren't going to share any images that they found embarrassing or images that went against their agenda of limited disclosure.
Maybe even Dr. Berggren got a hold of images they didn't want him to see.
Oh, he did. He did. And in fact, I think that if he had ever been able to finish his second book, that we would have seen some images that he had shown myself, this other gentleman that betrayed him, and one of the ladies that was a member of our group at the time. We all saw these images that would have been explosive. These images indicated why the bases on the moon and on Mars were left, where the early building of bases by America combined with the English, the French, and the Soviet Union in America were being built and weaponized. And they were driven off by a fungus that was let loose by ATs that said, you have gone against our understanding, so you're no longer welcome. And that's why we haven't been back to any of these places, and we won't be back to any of these places, because they were able to get there on EB craft, and now the understandings have changed that the EB craft carrying even humans will be brought down.
Wow. Do you think there was another planet in our solar system that was destroyed in a great explosion?
Yeah, that's what became the asteroid belt, was that planet, and that planet was even larger than Earth. It exploded and now makes up the asteroid belt, and that asteroid belt is being recombined into something else. When there was an image of a very large craft, if you want to call it that, it was a furnace that was in the 7th hour position of the sun. It seemed to have two funnels going into the past the corona of the sun and was there for days. And that was a furnace, and it was creating the metal for the superstructure of this new astral body.
Do you call that planet Melona Phaeton, or do you have another name for it?
No, of course, no name that people outside of the Earth would have for anything like that would seem familiar to people here today. I mean, there have been a number of things that touch on the 10th planet that have been discussed over the years, but it wasn't Planet X, it wasn't Nibiru, or any of the other fanciful myths. It was a planet that had a dramatic ending, and it involved some of your ancestors too.
Ah, yes. There was a civilization on that planet, wasn't there?
What they did on Mars was first experimented with on this planet.
Oh.
And they were trying to tap the mantle. And on Mars, the mantle was too thin to allow that. And so Mars went into rapid decline. And when it did, then they spent 25,000 years working out the technical complexities of coming to Earth and how to civilize Earth, which was dramatically savage with vulcanizations. And so that took 25,000 years to correct, and it was only done with the help of people that lived under Mars, on the surface of Mars at the time, and live there no more. In fact, what's very interesting is that when Tesla was talking about a hall of machines that he could access through ball lightning, which would make a kind of vortex, and he found that there was a communication system already set up to it, and he started communicating with these machines that were below the surface of Mars. And just right about then is when his laboratory was burned out. But he's been the only person to be able to create the ball lightning of that type. And that ball lightning, in many accounts, seems to have a will of its own almost. But I think, in my own way, I think that it is a form of recording information to be shared later on when people become civilized enough to be able to look in different directions for the sources of principle, scientific principle, that they have failed to develop and understand more than what they accept in a mythic way.
NASA says that there are some 60 moons around Saturn, but I don't think all of these are moons. I think some of them are.
Oh, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. Well, for a number of years, NASA has proclaimed that these migrating moons are anomalous movement moons and all that. Describe them as moons. Well, the moon has fixed orbit around the body, mostly a planet, and they can't migrate, so they have fixed orbit by definition. But, definition and principle and all this doesn't mean anything to NASA as it hides from the truth or tries to hide us from the truth. So NASA doesn't spend a day of its time without dreaming up the next big yarn to throw at us to hide something that is right before our noses if we would only realize it.
Yeah, I think some of these quote-unquote moons around Saturn are just fragments of this destroyed planet that you were talking about.
It could be, because that could be in the mix. The EMVs would have to arrange for that to happen, because anything coming from the asteroid belt is going to develop speed as it goes through a series of larger bodies. That's just astrophysics, until it progresses to around 30,000 miles an hour.
So the group that was on Mars actually was experimenting with this other planet. Did they try to divert an ocean into a volcano? What exactly were they doing when they blew their planet up? They blew one planet up, and then they went and did the same thing almost on Mars, too, didn't they?
What they were trying to do is develop a relationship of energy between a planet's mantle and the sun, because that was the only way they understood. Your ancestors came from a binary solar system with two suns. They didn't understand the intricacy of how they would have to permutate their technology in order to do it in a single sun system like ours. So what they were trying to do basically is to develop a means of travel so they could go into deep space. And that has to do with what you can see around the sun today. Today, there is such a means of travel, and you could see it plainly before the SOHO satellite. And those that have access to the raw data coming from the SOHO satellite, NASA was able to tighten the lid down on the security, so now you don't see it. And it's what I created a name for, because Shuni, a close friend of mine, said, well, you got to give it a name. And so I ascribed it the solar anvil. But it was prominent in all those images for the better part of 3 months and showed up in later images. But then again, it's a filament on the lens, it's this, it's that. No. As that satellite moves, the position of any filament on the lens is going to be in a different place with respect to the same spots on the sun, same position. And the solar anvil is just off the sun at a 1 o'clock position, and it takes up an area. It has an arc, which would be about a fourth of the arc of the elliptic of the sun. So it is sizable, but it is used for portage, for deep space portage. That is, bringing ships in from deep space economically. And of course, at the same time that this privileged data was reaching the public here by virtue of the fact that other space agencies were getting the raw feed and sharing it openly instead of NASA-like, there was some images that Shuni captured of two cylindrical craft coming through and then going out very fast to conserve energy by not having to keep their shields up. And they were very large cylindrical craft. But how would you explain that? You would explain that as craft using a solar anvil for portage from deep space.
And the solar anvil is a portal. These ships can jump across these vast distances using this portal. Is that correct?
they can go untold distances in seconds.
Yeah, it's almost like no time passing. They can just...
No time passes. But it is a way to utilize definitively in a certain particular pattern the energy of the star, not dissipating it. And that's the secret of why, you ask any scientist and he'll shrug his shoulders and come up with some stupid answer that somebody has given him because he doesn't want to seem like he don't want to seem perplexed because he's superior, right? Mm-hmm. So you ask him, well, how can a star burn billions and billions of years? He has no answer, really. And the reason is that there is a noble gas, the only truly noble gas, that has a relationship with hydrogen. It's not an element. It's helium. It's not an element. So it doesn't behave like an element. It should never have been put into the periodic chart of the elements because it's not an element, but it's unique. And what it is a condition of matter. And it is the most plentiful form of matter in the universe. It's created by the sun or by stars. And the only way that it occurs on Earth is as a byproduct of refining gasoline from oil. And even then, you have to really know some trade secrets to be able to collect it and contain it and reduce it to the only way it can be transferred long distances as a liquid.
James, we've got a kind of spooky synergy when you and I get talking. It always amazes me. We're almost out of time. We got 3 minutes left. If you wanted to make any closing statements or if Crystal wanted to tell people about her website.
I want Crystal to make the closing statements and to tell us about her website, if she would.
Well, my website is drowninginabsurdity.org, and James's website is emvsinfo.blogspot.com, and a lot of this information is on there. And I'm glad that James was able to join us because he, like I said, he has a view of intelligent design from the macroscopic level that reintroduces not just the necessity of it, but the beauty of the mind behind it and the beauty of the design itself. It's magnificent. And I think this again has a lot to do with why we have been relegated to living such vapid lives, not just physically, but intellectually. The truth is magnificent. It's inspiring. There are stirrings in the mind. There are directions to go, questions to ask that never would come into the equation otherwise. It's very, very beautiful, and I'm grateful that James shares it because we do live in a world where these things are intentionally hidden from us on purpose. I mean, I think humanity needs to get to a point where they will no longer let a religious cult, for lack of a better word, hide the texts of our ancestry from us.
It's always interesting, too, when I get James and you on because it always goes in some other direction than I originally planned because I had originally envisioned us talking about the alternative timeline, and then this all happened, and somehow it always seems to have some purpose because I always feel like it's never my plan that's executed. It's some other plan that kind of unfolds, which I think is very interesting. I do want to thank both of you guys for coming on. It's really been maybe next time, James, we can talk about the alternative timeline.
As you wish.
Well, folks, what we're discussing here is fascinating information, particularly the alternative timeline. And maybe next time we have James and Crystal back on, we can talk about the chip that was put in Napoleon's brain and the fact that we're not living on the main timeline. We are in an alternative timeline. So anyway, folks, thanks for listening today. You've been listening to Ohio Exopolitcs, and our guests have been James Horak and Crystal Clark. And thanks, Keith. I always appreciate you being the producer. So have a good evening, folks.
Wonderful show, you guys.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.